Hi, I'm Wayne and this is Bassador Woodworking. I'm back with another tool history video, and in this one we're going to explore arguably the most beloved and certainly my favorite woodworking tool of all time, the table saw. The table saw is the woodworking tool. It has long been considered the heart of the wood shop, and for a lot of woodworkers, it's their most used tool in the shop. A table saw is also usually one of the first power tools purchased by beginner woodworkers, and it's usually the tool the rest of the shop is built around for an experienced woodworker. As you can see in these images, it's conventional wisdom that you position the table saw in the functional center of your shop. This is because the placement of the table saw is often the most thought out of any tool, and it often dictates the placement of other machines. Let's use my shop as an example because we're already here. Anyone who's followed my channel for any amount of time has likely noticed that I reorganize my shop on a nearly constant basis. My wife is pretty confident that this is due to my ADHD, but I contend that I'm in a constant state of optimizing my workflow. The only tool that I have never moved in this shop in the years I've been in this space is the table saw. It's the first tool that I brought into the space when I was moving from my previous smaller shop, and I specifically placed the table saw here because it gives me open space on both sides of the saw so that I can process full sheets of plywood. The placement of the table saw then dictated the placement of my outfeed table with its built-in router table. Whenever I'm thinking through a workflow for a project, I use the table saw as my home location. So it's the point from which all other processes stem for whatever project I'm doing. So step one would be cut it on the piece of lumber on the table saw. Step two would be go to the drill press and drill the holes, so on and so forth. The table saw is often the largest flat surface in many small shops. Craftspeople will build them into impressive and elaborate workbenches to suit any woodworker in any project. It is also used extensively as my news desk when I want to speak about something in woodworking and want to show that I know what I'm talking about. I sit behind my table saw and I read off my prompter or off the notes that I have hidden just out of frame. And this video is no exception. I'll be using this particular framing extensively in this video. To sum it up in kind of an analogy, if you consider the pocket hole jig as kind of like the prostate of the wood shop, then the table saw is certainly its heart. All table saws, regardless of their form factor, share all the same basic components. You have the table, the feature for which the tool is named. The table is a flat surface, usually made of cast iron or aluminum, on which the material being processed is moved across. The blade, which cuts the material, is mounted beneath the tabletop and protrudes through a throat plate. The blade is mounted to an arbor. The arbor is usually, in America, it's 5/8 of an inch. In Europe, I believe it is 30 millimeters. I might be wrong on that. But the arbor is powered either directly by a motor in the case of a direct drive saw, or it is connected to a motor via pulling a belt for a belt-driven saw. You then have the fence, which is an adjustable guide that runs parallel to the blade and allows for rip cutting. You then have miter slots, usually on both sides of the blade, that run parallel to the blade and allow the use of sleds and, more importantly, a miter gauge. The miter slots are also what you true your blade off of. So you want your blade to always be parallel to your miter slots. You then can make your fence parallel to that. The miter gauge is used to guide material at an angle for making beveled and mitered cuts as well as cross cuts. We'll go into more depth about how to use a table saw later in this video, but let's get into some history. The invention of the table saw was the natural outcome of the invention of the circular saw blade. However, the invention of the circular saw blade has a bit of a contested history. We'll go through the different proposed histories in chronological order because I just think that makes the most sense. The claim placing the invention of the circular saw earliest chronologically was made by Joseph Illick in The Story of the American Lumbering Industry. Illick claims that the circular saw blade was invented in ancient Greece and cites a small saw used by Hippocrates, yes, of the Hippocratic Oath, for cutting holes in skulls. I've not been able to find a reference to the exact saw Illick may be referring to. The only ones I was able to find more closely resembled annular cutters, or a modern hole saw that you would run in a drill press. There are those who contend that there were rudimentary table saws used by the ancient Egyptians. So I was not able to find any solid references to whether they were table saws as we would define them now, or if they were more akin to a sawmill that had a vertical blade instead of a circular. In his book, Woodworking Machinery, Its Rise, Progress, and Construction, published in 1880, Powis Bale contends that the circular saw blade originated from Holland in the 16th or 17th century, but the inventor is unknown. As a complete side note, this is an excellent resource, and I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to give it a look. You can get free versions online, but I just really wanted the hard copy of it. There's a claim that the circular saw blade was invented in the third quarter of the 18th century by Walter Taylor of England, who had a contract for making pulley blocks for the Royal Navy. One of the arguments against Taylor is that he already held 2 patents related to pulley block manufacturing, but there's no record of him ever attempting to patent a circular saw blade, and that there's no mention of a circular saw blade in any other patents. So people argue that, well, he obviously knew the patenting process. Why, if he invented this, why wouldn't he have gone out and tried to patent that as well? Samuel Miller of England obtained a patent for a saw windmill in 1777. This is not the Samuel Miller you may be familiar with. This is not the Presbyterian theologian. It's Samuel Miller of Southampton, England. And this is definitely not the correct Samuel Miller, but this is what came up when I searched for images of him on Google, and I laughed for like 10 minutes, so we're just going to roll with it. For all intents and purposes, from now on, this is Samuel Miller. This is often credited with the invention of the idea of a circular saw blade, because the patent is not directly related to the blade itself, it only mentions the form of the blade incidentally. Joseph Illick from earlier credits Miller with the rediscovery of the circular saw blade at this time. Some contend that the very fact he only incidentally mentions the form of a circular blade with teeth around its perimeter as proof that the circular saw blade already existed and was in common enough use by that time that it was not the subject of the patent and instead was only referred to as a simple component in a larger machine. There's a Scientific American publication that cites a Mr. Coop with the invention of this first English circular saw in 1791, but does not provide much information to support the claim, and others have argued that the claim does not take into account the poor communication channels available to anyone with some kind of new invention in the 18th century, and that it's likely that if Mr. Coop were making the claim of inventing the first circular saw, it was only because he was not aware of the others that already existed. Now, the history of the circular saw blade may be able to be melded and folded into the history of rotary cutters. You see, by the time the earliest patents mentioning circular saw blades were being processed, rotary cutters had been used for cutting the gears for clocks and scientific instruments for up to the past 200 years before. So it's hard to believe that woodworkers could not have just independently adapted the technology to suit their own needs. This brings us to the most recent theory, and the one that I'm partial to, mainly because it happened in Massachusetts. This explanation also, though, has the most supporting documentation towards the creation and, more importantly, the intention behind the invention. Sarah Babbitt, who went by Tabitha, invented the first circular saw blade in 1813. This blade was designed to be used in a sawmill. See, Tabitha was a member of the Harvard Shakers. For those that don't know, the Shakers are an offshoot of Christianity that began in England in the 1740s and made it over to the newly declared United States in the 1780s. The practices of the Shakers aim to create a heaven on earth through communal lifestyle, pacifism, simple living, equality of the sexes, and most important to our discussion is technological innovation. They're also the group of people that Shaker-style furniture is named for and came from. The story goes that Tabitha was watching men use a 2-man whip saw to mill some lumber, as one does, and noticed that a great deal of the motion involved in using the saw was purely wasted effort. That's to say, it did not directly contribute to making of the cut, and that a circular blade would be far more efficient. If there's one hallmark of 19th century American woodworking, it's the pursuit of economy, efficiency, and increased production. This usually took the form of just making things spin faster. There are, however, issues with the claim that Tabitha invented the circular saw blade. There are claims made by the Shakers themselves of using circular or buzz saws as early as 1803, 10 years before they invented them. There are also records in the Transactions of the New York State Agricultural Society from 1870. These records state that there was a gift of a 12.5-inch circular saw blade that had been forged by Benjamin Bruce of New Lebanon, New York in 1792. However, the date for this blade can't be verified. So all in all, it pains me to say that the circular saw blade was not invented in Massachusetts by the Shakers. Although I would love for the circular saw blade to have been invented in Massachusetts, it simply wasn't. But the Shakers in Massachusetts were undoubtedly among the early adopters and innovators on the technology. Whoever truly invented it, whoever the first one was, is really beside the point on this moving forward, because the circular saw blade was being used and it was far more efficient than what was typically available in a lumber mill, and it had nearly no wasted energy going into the blade. Whereas conventional frame, sash, and reciprocating saws only cut in one stroke, the circular saw provided a constant cut. And it also added the convenience of being a more portable option than sawmills of other varieties. Sawmills could be easily set up on a site and could process lumber more efficiently in place. Moving away from the sawmill and into the woodshop did not take long. The earliest examples of table saws in the wood shops were powered by turning a large hand wheel, much like you'd see with early wood lathes. These allowed craftspeople to more easily and repeatedly cut panels for furniture and other projects. Once they were in the shop, they immediately became fixtures of the space. Well before the use of electric motors, there were a number of ways to power a table saw. By the 1870s, you see ads for table saws that were powered by a large hand crank that an assistant would turn while the other operator would guide the workpiece, like I mentioned just a minute ago. In 1878, you saw treadle-powered saws being manufactured by W.F. and John Barnes Company of Rockford, Illinois. You even have some examples of steam-driven saws around this time. These saws were followed up in 1888 when you start to see table saws marketed with an electric motor. And this seems like a natural place to set the cutoff for what is considered a modern saw. One thing you'll notice when looking at these examples is just how closely they resemble modern saws. For sure, there are a few safety features, the machines could have been refined over the years, but the bones remain largely unchanged, and the only major difference is how the power is supplied to the saw. So we'll use the integration of electric motors as our point of difference between historical and modern saws. The modern table saw has taken many form factors and has boasted different features geared towards different demographics, but still they're all cut from the same cloth and would be recognizable as your standard table saw today. Table saws in the late 1800s and early 1900s were massive cast iron machines that would outlive the entire bloodline of the person that purchased it, and they had these large tilting tables, and they were not anyone's idea of portable, but that was quickly changing. There was a need for smaller saws that would fit into a smaller or home workshop. The first portable table saw was manufactured in 1924 by Art Emmons, who invented the skill saw. It was originally intended to be a handheld circular saw that would be mounted into a table on a job site to create a rudimentary table saw, but it quickly became just as useful outside of the shackles of a table, and that's the history of the handheld circular saw. We'll go into that in a different video. In the 1920s and early 30s, you start to see the big names that are still prevalent today start putting out saws on the market. The mid-20s saw the start of the Craftsman 101 and 103 line of table saws. These were smaller, home-focused saws that were manufactured by the likes of Atlas and Dunlap, who were already established names in the space, and they sold these saws under the Sayers Craftsman brand. In 1938, the Delta Machine Company created what is still considered by many to be the perfect table saw. At the time, it was marketed based on a new feature of a tilting arbor, but is now known as the Delta Unisaw. Not only did the Unisaw exhibit a new tilting arbor, which allowed for easier bevel cutting, but it also had an extremely accurate and large capacity of up to 50 or so inches fence system. These saws are still highly coveted and they do not last long on the used market. They were robust enough to be used in industrial environments, but safe and had a small enough footprint to make their way into the home shop. An early Delta Unisaw is definitely on my list of dream tools, right along with an old Bridgeport mill. In the years since the Unisaw, there have been improvements in safety, portability, and affordability to the table saw, but I don't think any particular table saw has nailed the design in the way the Delta did with the Unisaw. From the 1960s on, table saws were more or less divided into a few different categories. Portable saws, later called job site saws. These were small saws meant for job site use or in a shop that does not have the need or room for a stationary saw. These are often direct drive saws with a decent amount of power and usually have a folding stand to make transporting the saw easier, and they can sometimes overlap with this next category of saw, which is benchtop saws. These are small direct drive saws with limited power. They often do not support dado stacks or molding heads, and they're designed for more light duty tasks and less frequent use. Next, you have contractor saws. These are larger and more powerful than the previous two types. They come in both direct drive and belt driven models. They're intended for contractors and more serious hobbyists. They typically have cast iron tops and are still mobile, but less so than the other two types. They can accommodate a dado stack, and this table saw happens to be a contractor saw. The next category you have is cabinet saws. A cabinet table saw is a heavy-duty stationary saw designed for professional woodworking shops and industrial settings. They feature the most robust construction with enclosed cabinets for dust collection and vibration reduction. Cabinet saws typically have larger tables, more powerful motors, and greater cutting capacities than contractor and portable saws. The next category you'll see is hybrid saws. These are a mix between the contractor saw and the cabinet saw. They typically have the internals of a contractor saw, but in the case of a cabinet saw. You'll see contractor saws and hybrid saws show up interchangeably when you're shopping for a saw online. The next category that you'll see is a sliding table saw. Sliding table saws are essentially a cabinet saw that features a sliding carriage mechanism that allows the table surrounding the blade to move forward and backwards. This increases the cutting capacity and accuracy of the saw. These saws are commonly used for cutting large panels, sheets, and other oversized materials. They're popular in professional woodworking shops and also in the cabinet making industry. The last category of table saws are mini table saws. These are a thing unto themselves. They're tiny versions of a table saw geared towards specialized hobbyists. They're dope and I want one. I would probably get a few comments if I didn't mention the ShopSmith table saw, so I'll briefly touch on it. For those that don't know, this is a ShopSmith. It's a marvel of engineering that's essentially a woodworking multi-tool. It can be set up in different configurations to accomplish nearly endless woodworking tasks. Their entire channel is dedicated to the use and history of ShopSmiths. One of the most well-known is My Growth Rings. I'll link Scott's channel down below. But briefly, I would classify the ShopSmith table saw as being closest akin to a contractor saw. The reasons being it is belt-driven. Inside the case, there is a variable speed belt and pulley system. It can accommodate a dado stack. And with the right setup and extension tables, it can be a very capable saw. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I've owned two ShopSmiths in the past, and I currently still own one. But I've only ever used it as a table saw a single time. It scares the living hell out of me. And it's not because a ShopSmith table saw is inherently more dangerous than other table saws, but because I'm decently short and the blade's a little high for comfort when it's set up as a table saw for me. I have this fear that if I were to experience kickback, I'd take it right to the throat. But that's a me thing. It's completely a fear out of ignorance type of reaction on my part. Just watch Scott's videos on the ShopSmith. He's infinitely more knowledgeable than I am about them. He will, if you want to use a ShopSmith, he will show you how to do so that it's just as safe as any other power tool. This seems like as good a point as any to transition into the topic of safety around the table saw. Table saws are among the most useful tools you can have in your shop, but they're not without their criticisms and dangers. They're usually one of the most powerful machines a person will have in their shop, And unlike the radial arm saw, they're common. You would have a really hard time going and finding any professional shop that does not have a table saw in it. It's one of the first tools home woodworkers will purchase, and due to this, they account for a significant portion of the total injuries that happen in shops. So let's take a closer look at the safety of the table saw. I did a full video on table saw safety a couple of years ago. I think it's a decent video with a lot of important information in it, so I would encourage you to watch it. I'll link it in the description. But let's take a look at what are considered standard table saw safety features. A blade guard is exactly what it sounds like. It's a shield that sits over the blade, and it's intended to eliminate the ability of the operator to come in contact with the blade. These are little dangly bits that act as a vertical featherboard, more on those later, that allow the wood to only move forward through the blade. These are a safety device intended to eliminate kickback, which most woodworkers would tell you is the most common cause of injury on a table saw. You see, kickback is when a workpiece is pinched between the fence and the blade or is lifted by the back of the blade, both causing the workpiece to be forcibly ejected back at you during a cut. This process can injure you in endless ways, but still the most common would be by whacking you with the ejected workpiece. While that happens, it can also pull your feed hands into the blade, which can then lead to, amputations and cuts and all that kind of stuff. The main difference between a riving knife and a splitter is that a riving knife can typically move up and down with the blade and can typically remain installed when making non-through cuts. This is a power switch that is common on most power tools, and it allows you to kill power to the saw while keeping your hands on the workpiece. It also locks into the off state via magnetic switch that you need to purposely pull out to reset. In 1999, Dr. Steve Gass invented the blade stopping technology for the saw stop table saw and forever changed the categories by which table saws were divided. 1, able to cut hot dogs. 2, not able to cut hot dogs. This may be controversial, and I know that people love saw stops, and it becomes a large part of their identity as a woodworker, just like Peloton users. But I'm just going to come out and say it. The saw stop is really shitty at cutting hot dogs. But seriously, the technology behind the saw stop's braking mechanism is actually really neat. The saw tracks the electrical conductivity of the blade, and when that conductivity changes due to contact with human skin or hot dogs, a safety cartridge triggers a block of aluminum to shoot into the blade while simultaneously pulling the blade beneath the table. This happens in milliseconds, and the blade is stopped and your hot dogs are safe. That pretty much sums up the safety features that you will see built into the table saw. But that doesn't mean that that is all that is available to a woodworker to keep them safe. Now, this table saw was made in the early to mid 1970s, so it's lacking in what most woodworkers would be expecting in terms of safety features. They've either been lost throughout the years or they were simply never offered with this saw. It doesn't have a blade guard or a riving knife, and this saw will not hesitate to cut through a hot dog. Still, it's the only saw that I have, and all of the safety practices remain the same, whether your saw can cut hot dogs or not. So we'll continue to use this saw in our demonstration. And just because this saw does not have the same out-of-the-box safety features of more modern saws, it does not mean that it cannot be safely operated. Safety is the responsibility of the operator, and I do everything in my power to minimize the risk of using the saw by utilizing other available safety mechanisms. This includes featherboards. A featherboard is used to apply constant pressure on the workpiece in the direction of the fence. They're most commonly slot into a miter slot, but they also have some that use mag switches built in. These can be used on cast iron tabletops. They won't work on aluminum ones, obviously. But these ones with magnets can be placed anywhere on the table and provide pressure towards the fence.
This right here is my favorite featherboard. It's called Hedgehog, and I like it because it's designed to be operated completely one-handed. It's important to place the featherboard just before the saw blade, but not overlapping with the blade at all. You're pushing the workpiece into the fence, not into the side of the blade. Push sticks. These are among the most critical safety features you can have. It doesn't necessarily matter which style push stick you use, whichever is more comfortable for you. My only recommendation would be, and I might get some shit in the comments for this, but is not to buy those expensive push sticks for a table saw. Think of a push stick as a consumable for your shop. It's meant to be used and tossed out when it's worn out. I see people buying $50 push sticks and it's utterly foreign to me. I don't understand the rationale behind it at all. A zero clearance insert. This reduces the probability of a small cutoff from falling into the saw and being ejected back at you. Outfeed support. Whether it be a table or one of those rollers, outfeed support is often overlooked as a safety precaution. Having your workpiece supported at the back end of the cut allows the operator to be able to safely finish the cut without having to continuously increase the amount of pressure they're applying to the saw. Think of it like the saying, there's nothing more dangerous than a dull knife. The thought behind that is that if you're using a dull knife, you need to work harder and apply more pressure. So if something slips or something is in the path of the cut, you're more likely to do damage, as you're really sending it instead of letting the tool do the work. It's the same concept here. Jigs. The right jig on the table saw will not only increase the efficiency of the process, but it will also add to its safety. Aside from any safety device, there are sound safety practices, which I go into more detail about in my table saw safety video. But to sum it up in a sentence, there is no blade guard or safety mechanism in the world that can make up for bad safety practices. Now we're at the point in the video where we can start diving into some data. A figure I keep seeing across the internet, it's in videos, articles, and it's on websites, including the SawStop website, is that there are 65,000 table saw injuries per year in the US alone. And of course, this is provided without any citation because that would be helpful to the people trying to research these things. And you'll see videos referencing slightly different numbers, some around 60,000, some around 50,000. However, I can't find any hard data to back up those claims. And those figures should kind of stand out to you as ridiculous at face value. That would mean that more than the population of the University of Florida at 60,795 are being injured annually using table saws. That would mean that there's a person getting injured by a table saw every 8.08 minutes. That's an insane figure. For reference, here are other things that happen in the US every 8 minutes. The American Red Cross responds to an emergency, a person is added to the National Transplant waiting list, a pedestrian is involved in a motor vehicle accident, and an audience loses their attention span. Let's look at that figure in the context of the radial arm saw injuries from the previous video. It only took 300 instances of injury over 40 years for there to be a massive recall on radial arm saws, news reports, and massive decommissioning pushes that led to the saw to lose most, if not all, of its popularity. In short, if there were over 65,000 injuries a year happening with a table saw, it would be massive, inescapable news. I figured the easiest way to determine where the 65,000 injury stat came from would be to simply ask. So I did just that. While on the SawStop website, a little chat box popped up and I was greeted by Brad. So I asked Brad on the SawStop website where they got that figure, and he quickly directed me to email the sales at SawStop email address, which I did. After a few days, I had not received a reply from the sales address, so I reached out to their standard information email that is listed in the contact area of their website. A couple of days after emailing the information address, I did receive a reply from the people over at SawStop. They thanked me for my email and said, hey, the original citation came from the NEISS injury data, and they must have lost the citation when they updated their website. Which is cool. I'm glad that they answered the email, they answered the question. Their explanation, I have a few problems with, though. One, the NEISS data I have been able to pull does not support this figure. And they have been quoting this 65,000 injury figure for over 10 years. You would think that if their saw was addressing that problem, you would see the numbers go down by now. They have a 10-year sample size. So I used the internet's Wayback Machine to view what their page looked like as far back as 2013. And in every year that I checked, which was from this year all the way back to 2013, I checked the last available archive of that year, so it's usually December or November, and at no point was that ever cited. They've used the same graphic. It's never been cited in the past 10 years on their website. As of recording this website as well, since they mentioned to me that, hey, we missed the citation when we published this back on our website, they haven't added the citation back. Now, this is in no way meant to take a shot at SawStop. This is not in any way meant to say that there are not a lot of table saw injuries every year, because there are a lot of table saw injuries every year. But hard data supporting that is hard to come by. By looking at reports put out by the National Institute of Health, you'll see that they estimate that there are over 30,000 table saw injuries every year. The main report that provides this figure is a 2014 report titled Table Saw Injuries Epidemiology and a Proposal for Preventative Measures. And the cliff notes of this report are essentially, table saw dangerous, SawStop makes safer. And it's also important to note that a lot of the data that they base their estimates on is from 2005. And in all fairness, this is not easy data to track. For one, not all injuries are reported. For example, an injury resulting in a trip to the ER will likely show up on the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission's NEISS database, but that depends on the information being accurately communicated during a patient's intake. Databases do not account for near misses, where a disaster is narrowly averted, where an accident occurs but there is no resultant injury, which makes sense. I mean, how could they? I would contend that the vast majority of incidents with power tools would be near misses. I've had countless near misses across all of my different power tools, but I can count the number of accidents I have had on a single hand. And a hand that still has all of its fingers, mind you. But that's the nature of estimates like this. Since there's no solid number, SawStop can state that there are over 65,000 injuries a year, and there's not really any data to refute it. The same as there's no data to support it. Still, if you Google how many table saw injuries are there a year, the first result is from SawStop saying there's over 65,000, when the highest number I could find reported by the government is an estimate of less than half of the number that SawStop is promoting as the number of injuries. So let's pivot back to the 30,000 figure, and let's assume that the National Institute of Health is acting completely in good faith, and that's the estimate that they're going with, that they've taken into account a bunch of factors. That's the number of table saw injuries they feel there are annually. 30,000 is a significant number on its own. When you inflate it to a bigger, scarier number like 65,000, you reduce the impact of the actual figure. You see 30,000 accidents as an improvement, which is insane. It's still an injury every 16 to 18 minutes. In my attempt to find some solid numbers on annual injuries, I again went searching for some independent sources. Just as I did with the radial arm saw, I went over to the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission's NEISS database, and I searched the last 10 available years of table saw injuries. You know, just for fun. The first thing you will likely notice when looking at this data is that it is way less than the estimated 30,000 injuries per year. And yes, you're correct, that is how numbers work. There are not even 30,000 over a 10-year period. But I thought to myself, these reports are tracking primarily non-industrial injuries. Maybe if I look at industrial accidents, it will close the gap between the two figures. To do this, I went over to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, more commonly known by their acronym OSHA, to take a look at their accident reporting statistics. And now I'll admit that their website is not as easy to navigate, and it can be kind of a pain to get to the right page. But eventually I was able to find a portal where you can search their database by keywords. So naturally I used the term table saw and left all other parameters wide open. I wanted a direct pull of everything they had involving a table saw in their database. And I was presented with 1,303 results dating back to 1972. This number seems insanely small to me, so I started reading some of the reports, and OSHA will have records for workplace injuries that involve a table saw even loosely. Sometimes an accident not involving a table saw, but in the presence of one, will show up on the report. For example, a worker was killed when a table saw was being lowered in an industrial lift. While the lift was going down, someone was leaning over a railing at the edge of the shaft, and the cart with the table saw pinned the worker by the neck, and the worker unfortunately died. This was categorized in the same search poll as table saws because a table saw was present. It's also worth noting that accidents only become published in the OSHA dataset once the investigation into the incident is completed. But still, if we take that 30,000 figure to be correct, that would mean that a database going back 52 years with an estimated 30,000 incidents per year, which is a conservative figure, seeing as table saws have increased their safety mechanisms over the past 52 years. But over 52 years, there would have been an estimated 1,560,000 open investigations that just haven't been published to the database, which clearly isn't the case. So the main takeaway you should have from this is that there really is no hard data, at least none that I could find in the considerable amount of time I devoted to it, to support either figure, the 30,000 or the 60,000. Could there be that many injuries a year? Sure, but the hard data doesn't align with those figures. Ultimately, statistics are meaningless to the individual anyway, so at the end of the day, your safety in the shop is ultimately your responsibility. And you should take any safety steps you feel are appropriate to that end. And not to be too repetitive with my other videos, though my 7th grade teacher, sup Jim Gogolis, used repetition is the mother of skill as the mantra for our chemistry and biology classes, which I'm pretty sure he stole from Tony Robbins. But fun fact, he was also an actor and a bodybuilder, and he would stand on the desk and flex to show us the different muscle groups. It was intense, and it sounds bad out of context, but it wasn't. Here's a clip of him in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Here's one of my favorite teachers. I hope he's doing well. But anyway, back to the actual point of this. Safety is the name of the game when it comes to anything with a motor or a blade. You should not be afraid of any of your tools. You should, however, respect them, because they'll have no respect for you. In a prior video, I talked about how one of the main benefits a woodworker gets using stationary tools is repeatability, that it's the ability to make the same cut over and over efficiently. And the table saw is still the king of repeatability. You set the fence or attach a stop block to your miter gauge and you go. With the proper jig, there are few cuts that cannot be performed safely with a table saw. There are countless videos on this platform showcasing incredibly creative and specialized jigs for the table saw. Some of my favorites are the videos put out by the likes of Izzy Swan or Matthias Wando. I'll leave some links in the description. But you might say, what if you're a beginner and you're just overwhelmed by or have no interest in creating specialty jigs, and you just want to know why you should have a table saw? Precision cutting. Table saws are known for their ability to make precise and accurate cuts. The flat and stable surface of the table combined with a sturdy fence and miter gauge allow woodworkers to make straight, repeatable cuts with ease. Again, repeatability. Versatility. Table saws can be used for a wide range of cutting tasks, including rip cuts where you cut along the length of the wood, or cross cuts where you cut across the width of the wood. Bevel cuts, miter cuts, rabbets, and dado cuts. Efficiency. Table saws are efficient tools for processing large volumes of wood quickly and accurately. They can make straight cuts faster and more consistently than any other cutting tool. This reduces the time and effort required to complete woodworking projects. Ease of use. Table saws are relatively easy to set up and operate, especially as you become a more experienced woodworker. Once the saw is properly calibrated and adjusted, making accurate cuts becomes straightforward. Table saws are not difficult to set up, maintain, and adjust. For all their features, they're pretty simple machines. I did an entire video concerning table saw maintenance. I'll link it down below. As you become more comfortable with the tool and start to undertake more challenging projects, you'll want to start integrating jigs and fixtures into your woodworking. Table saws can be used with conjunction of various jigs, fixtures, sleds to expand the capabilities and improve the accuracy for specific tasks. These include anything from crosscut sleds, tapering jigs, tenoning jigs, box joint jigs, which they can enhance the versatility and the precision of the table saw. A good table saw has also added benefits that are tertiary to the function of the tool. This includes, in the case of a contractor, hybrid, or cabinet saw, it provides you with a large flat surface. This can be used as a reference surface for other things in the shop, testing the flatness of lumber, things like that, but it can also provide you a surface for assembly. My table saw was my workbench in my first shop. I was working out of half of a tiny 2-car garage in Boston, and I could only fit a few tools in that space. I had this 9-inch regular arm saw mounted to an old end table, this 12-inch Craftsman bandsaw, and this little 5-speed Harbor Freight drill press. And most importantly, I had a Craftsman 113 flex drive table saw that my father-in-law gave me. It's the same saw that I gave away in a previous video. It had these large cast iron wings on it, so that was my workbench, assembly table, and flat reference surface. The holes in the wings made it convenient for drilling holes because this tiny little Harbor Freight drill press was very limited. I could also use the holes in the wings to allow me to clamp things in place, but still, I was able to make some really cool stuff in that tiny space. I made a TARDIS, and that was cool. As we look through the history of the table saw, we're reminded of its transformative impact on woodworking and construction industries. Spawning from the contested history of the circular saw blade into a hand-cranked or treadle-powered tool, and then into the modern-day saw with the introduction of the electric motor. Table saws are now equipped with advanced safety features, and we're now sitting at the edge of the next large evolution of the table saw with the proposed legislation that would make safety mechanisms like the one in SawStop to be required in some cases. Whatever changes come down the line for the table saw, the versatility and efficiency of this machine is a testament to how simple they really are. They have revolutionized woodworking techniques, enabling intricate cuts, joinery, and cabinetry with unparalleled precision and, again, repeatability. The table saw is the heart of the wood shop, and it remains the indispensable tool for craftsmen, hobbyists, and professionals. So whether you're a seasoned woodworker, be it a hobbyist or a professional, or just starting on your woodworking journey, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the history of the table saw, and let me know which tool you'd like me to explore next. We've now done 3 saws. Is anyone interested in the history of the drill press? Thank you for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to keep up to date with new projects as they are released. And until next time, thank you.